Nearly a month at the start of the free agency period, John Schneider and Mike McDonald still know there's plenty of work left to be done at guard, and it looks like a few veterans could be coming in for stage 2 free agent visits. We'll be diving in to the depth chart at guard and a couple potential veteran additions the team could make coming up next here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. Those of you watching on YouTube, you might notice that I forgot to upload today's background, so I'm going to put that up while we're speaking here because Nick Lee is not on the show. We've got Rob Rang joining in, so welcome, Rob, as usual here for our Monday show. A special thanks to all the 12s. As always, thanks for tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. And hope everyone had an excellent Easter weekend. Coming up on today's show, it's Mock Draft Monday, and my co-host Rob Rang finally going to be dropping his latest 7-round mock draft. I'm going to be critiquing, combing through those selections at the new players he's got joining the Seahawks. Should be a jam-packed episode coming your way, courtesy of FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. As John Schneider has discussed numerous times over the past week, both at the NFL League meetings and his weekly radio show on Seattle Sports 710, he's well aware that the Seahawks have significant concerns at the guard position, particularly from an experience standpoint. And on Thursday in that radio show, he made it clear to host Dave Wyman and Bob Stelden that this is going to be a position they still plan to bring some veterans in. As it turns out today, we found out 2 names, one that we have talked about quite a bit to this point, and one who has not been on the radar that the Seahawks could consider to plug into the lineup at the guard spots. Laken Tomlinson, from my sources, it sounds like sometime middle of this week that he's going to be visiting with the Seahawks at the VMAX. So their interest there looks to be mutual. The other name that is being rumored out there by a couple of reporters, including Jeremy Fowler of ESPN, is former Bears starter and Pro Bowler Cody Whitehair. And as I mentioned, Rob, that's not a name that we've discussed at all to this point, but as we've mentioned time and time again, it shouldn't come as a surprise the Seahawks are still looking at veteran guards with most of their free agency list taken care of because there's such a dearth of experience at both guard spots right now.
There absolutely is. And when you consider the fact that Laken Tomlinson was a high second-round selection, and then with Cody Whitehair, talking about a guy who was Laken Tomlinson was a first-round selection. Cody Whitehair was a second-round selection. Both of them were Pro Bowlers. It's understandable why the Seahawks would prioritize meeting with both of these interior offensive linemen and their size, their physicality, as I mentioned, with the fact that both of them have been Pro Bowlers. This is exactly what John Schneider has done throughout his time as general manager of the Seahawks. Is he is going to let people overpay, especially for non-premium positions like offensive guard. And then he's going to try to find himself a diamond in the rough or great value in the second wave of free agency. So I think this is kind of the perfect segue as we start to kind of get into April and the NFL draft. And as Corbin said, happy Easter to all of you. Thank you so much for all of your support. But I really think that this is a fascinating time during the offseason for the Seahawks, because this is a club that is a little bit, despite the fact that they had a great deal of money for free agency early on, they spent a lot of that money, and yet left guard remains obviously an eyesore at this point. You got, Tremaine Ankrum that you brought in as a free agent. You assume that you are going to be retaining Anthony Bradford is going to continue as the starting right guard at this spot, but still, center is a concern. You're assuming that Olu Oluwatimi is going to take over for Evan Brown. You brought in Nick Harris, but obviously there's not a lot of starting experience at that spot. And at the guard positions, you have Anthony Bradford started a couple of games as a rookie a year ago. But my goodness, Corbin, when you're talking about Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas as being the most veteran players on your starting five at the offensive line position, then you do have to have some concerns about it. So I'm excited to talk about this draft class as far as offensive linemen. And that's one of the things I think that Schneider and the Seahawks are going to, in their own words, they need to evaluate the free agent possibilities that are out there and then kind of compare and contrast it to what might be available to them in this draft class. And again, I'm excited about the possibility of a guy like a Laken Tomlinson as well as a Cody Whitehair, but I also think that the Seahawks may find that when it's all said and done, that some of the rookie prospects at those respective positions might actually be better than what is available to them in free agency.
Yeah, this is all about comparative analysis. And the Seahawks were doing this throughout the free agency period before they signed linebackers or they brought in backup tackles like a George Fant. They're considering the options that they have there. And it has been telling that they decided to prioritize other positions because that does suggest that John Schneider is looking towards the draft to really find that long-term answer at left guard to replace Damian Lewis. At the same time, even if you draft a really good guard in the first round, that doesn't take care of the issue. Who's going to be your veteran leader? I mean, maybe quiet Charles Cross is ready for that mantle, but I'd be surprised if he is. Abraham Lucas has more of the personality to handle that. But again, he has started 1.5 seasons in the league. You've got a major void there from an experience standpoint. Oluwatimi has started 1 game. Anthony Bradford, it didn't feel like it, but he started 10 games last year. He's almost as experienced as Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas are, but it's still just 10 starts. Ankrum has started 1 game in the NFL. Nick Harris has started 1 game at guard. He's got a couple other starts at center. I mean, this is as ripe of a group as you're going to find. So I think we have to dive into these veterans. And we mentioned Laken Tomlinson last week on one of our earlier shows because that has been a name that I've heard for several weeks the Seahawks had interest in. But there are a lot of parallels when we're talking about these two players, Tomlinson and Whitehair. And I think the reason that they really jump out to the Seahawks, they were both cut by their previous teams. So they are not going to count against the compensatory pick formula. And Schneider seems to be playing that more heavily this year than he has the last 3 or 4 years. Both these guys are 31 going on 32, so they're not young players, but offensive linemen can play at a high level into their mid to late 30s. So that's not as big of a concern at this position. But Rob, I look at comparing these two, and I think where the similarities end is in terms of where the strengths are at on the field. Laken Tomlinson is more of a bulldozer at the guard position. And that's why he was such a good fit for the San Francisco 49ers, where he had the best seasons of his career. He was a Pro Bowler for the 49ers in 2021. And up until last year, he consistently scored better for Pro Football Focus and run blocking grades. The film matches that. The pass pro was fine, but he's been known for his run blocking. Last year took a big step back, according to PFF. I don't necessarily see that on the film. I see a very dysfunctional offense that made it tough to be a lineman in New York last year, especially without Aaron Rodgers. And I almost feel like I'm on the other end of the spectrum because Cody Whitehair, I feel like looking at his production, his PFF grades, it matches more with what I'm seeing on film. I thought last year was a real struggle for him, a former Pro Bowler himself in Chicago. And it just didn't look like we saw the same athlete, especially in the run game. He had his share of issues in pass pro. Justin Fields contributes to that. As Seahawks fans know with Russell Wilson, it's hard to defend or block for a mobile quarterback like that extends plays. And still, it felt like his play, even though he only gave up 3 sacks compared to 7 from Laken Tomlinson, the film paints a different picture than some of these stats do. So as far as I stand right now, if they're going to sign one of these guys, maybe Whitehair just needs a change of scenery and a different coach to get him back at playing his best. But I actually feel like Tomlinson of these two is the more intriguing player.
No, I 100% agree with you. I think that Laken Tomlinson, even though he's bounced around three different clubs at this point, I do think that he remains the more physical player, and that's absolutely what I expect that Mike McDonald is going to be prioritizing. Certainly, Scott Huff, as Seattle's new offensive line coach, is likely to be prioritizing as well. Look, there's no doubt about it. I mean, when you look at Ryan Grubb as the offensive coordinator, Scott Huff, coming from the University of Washington. Everybody wants to talk about the quarterback and the receivers, and they get this reputation as being a little bit more of a finesse type of offense. But when the Huskies needed to do so, they were physical at the point of attack. So I agree. I think that Laken Tomlinson makes a little bit more sense with what I anticipate the Seahawks are going to want to do. 6'3", 325 pounds. He's a powerful guy. He does have some lateral limitations, and that's one of the reasons why after the Detroit Lions selected him in the first round, he basically got peddled to the San Francisco 49ers that used him the way that he should be used. It's just kind of coming off the line and moving people at the line of scrimmage. Cody Whitehair has stuck his entire career at the Chicago Bears, but Corbin, I didn't see a guy nearly as athletic this past season for the Bears as he was previously in his career. And you make an excellent point about just the limitations of the talent around you, especially with Cody Whitehair blocking for a guy like Justin Fields, who is looking to run almost as quickly as he gets the ball in his hands. That makes things complicated. And again, Laken Tomlinson, same kind of a thing here, in that there were some struggles with the New York Jets once the Aaron Rodgers went down. But I do think that these are two players that fit in similarly to Tremaine Ankrum. They can be quality backups. If Seattle's looking at them to be frontline starters, then maybe they're going to have to look at the NFL draft a little bit closer.
Yeah, I think that the game plan here, it doesn't matter if they sign one of these guys or not. The game plan is going to be, I would think, finding that long-term starter or starters at the guard position when we get to the draft later this month. Up next, speaking of the draft, it's Mock Draft Monday, and many of our listeners have been wondering, when are we going to get a new mock from Rob Rang? Well, today is the day. Post-Easter, we're going to have a 7-round mock draft. We're going to look at his selections on day 1 and day 2, the first 3 rounds. That'll be coming up next here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney with the Final Four set to kick off in Phoenix. Whether you are betting on North Carolina State to continue sporting a glass slipper or UConn to pull off a rare repeat, FanDuel makes it exciting to get in on the action. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. With 4 teams left in the field, all options are on the table and at your fingertips. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. It's time to transition back to the NFL draft. As we just discussed, Rob, even if the Seahawks sign a veteran guard, another one to add to the mix right now, this still feels like a position where right now they would just be adding Band-Aids. They need to get long-term answers at the guard spots, at least one of those guard positions in this draft. And so with that being said, it's time to dive into your latest 7-round mock draft. I'm going to give you an opportunity to kind of go through your picks and your trades, if you made any, and then I'll have my chance to either love your picks or rip them apart. It's going to be a lot of fun. Let's get to our first selections here on Rob's mock draft. Take away, good sir.
Yeah, I think that if you want to just take this draft the way that it is currently slated, and the Seahawks, of course, have the number 16 overall selection and then don't trade or don't pick again until number 81. That is a span of 65 selections total, Corbin. That is the biggest gap between the first pick and the second pick of any NFL team in this draft class. And that's why I project that the Seahawks are going to trade down, as John Schneider has done so many times. I'm just going to mention a couple of players here here in case the Seahawks do stand pat at number 16 overall. Look, John Schneider said it himself. I mean, he called the lack of interior offensive linemen on the squad, quote unquote, a fairly obvious need for the club. That said, John Schneider very rarely does what is fairly obvious on draft day. And so while I might think that maybe the Troy Fautanu might make an awful lot of sense if the Seahawks were to stand pat at number 16 overall, I don't think that will be the case at all. In fact, the mock draft that I have at Fox Sports right now actually has Seattle standing pat number 16 and going with the edge rusher for Florida State, Jared Verse, who I do think might be able to come in and make the immediate impact that Mike Macdonald wants to make. And if the Seahawks were to stand pat number 16, that presumably they would stand pat number 81 overall, then a player that I think would make an awful lot of sense is the player that you just have pictured there, that being Jordan Morgan, offensive lineman from the University of Arizona. But what I actually did for our exercise today, Corbin, is I did have the Seahawks trade back. I had them trading back with the Green Bay Packers, one of the scenarios that we have talked about previously. Seattle trading back from number 16 overall to number 25 overall. Green Bay giving up their 2 third-round picks. That's number 88 and number 91. If you look at the Jimmy Johnson model, it's basically exactly a match. If you look at the Rich Hill model, then maybe it's a little bit rich for the Seahawks, and maybe they might have to throw Green Bay back a 5th or a 6th round selection. But let's just focus in on this, exercise here where I have the Seahawks again trading down from number 16 to number 25 overall and ultimately wind up with 9 selections total. So again, what they would be getting is going from number 16 to then having number 25 as well as number 88 and number 91. And that's really what I think the Seahawks are looking to do, is to try to be able to create a few more picks on day 2, where the offensive and defensive linemen are pretty rich in terms of value. Now, going to number 25 overall, again, we know how John Schneider operates. He basically doesn't give a damn what anybody thinks about value at this point. And I think that he is going to be leaning heavily on his new head coach and his familiarity with Michigan, as well as his offensive coordinator and offensive line coach from the University of Washington, of course, as we talked about so many times. So I do have a couple of guys that the Seahawks would be selecting from the University of Washington, University of Michigan, and starting off with a national champion and a player that has all-pro bloodlines, and that being Chris Jenkins Jr. Now, the name should be familiar because he was a 4-time Pro Bowler as well as a 1-time All-Pro with the Carolina Panthers, at least that his father was. And then what I love about Chris Jenkins Jr., 6'3", 299 pounds, and he had a 4.91 40-yard dash. He has the athleticism you're looking for. What I really love about him, Corbin, is he has the physicality that you're looking for, that Mike Macdonald, most importantly, is looking for. 29 repetitions on the bench press with 34-inch arms. He was the co-defensive MVP for a Michigan Wolverines squad that, much to the chagrin of many football fans watching this podcast and listening, of the national champions. And so, again, to me, he is exactly the type of player that's going to give Seattle the versatility along the defensive line that Mike Macdonald enjoyed in Ann Arbor, as well as obviously with the Baltimore Ravens. The Seahawks brought back Leonard Williams. Of course, they got a stud in Jaron Reed. You're hoping to see a little bit more play from a Draymond Jones. To me, Chris Jenkins is the guy that can back up all of those players and also push each of them. Perhaps maybe not Leonard Williams, but still make Seattle's defensive line that much more formidable. So that would be my selection. I know that Chris Jenkins is not a player that's on an awful lot of mock drafts, but go back in time. How many players the Seahawks have selected during the John Schneider era were on a lot of the mock drafts 3 weeks before the draft?
That first pick, I think, makes a ton of sense for the Seahawks if they have traded down to the mid-20s. I would not take Chris Jenkins at number 16 because I don't think right now he is that level of player. There are flashes of him being a top 15 caliber talent, but he hasn't had the pass rushing production that you would necessarily expect from a guy that ran a 4.9 140 at around 300 pounds. He's a freak athlete. He does have an explosive first step. He is a player, though, that I'm not necessarily sure fits that bill of being consistent enough where you would draft him that early. And yet at 25, especially with Mike Macdonald signing off on it, he coached him a couple years ago. So it would make a ton of sense. As far as a few of your other selections on day one, I want to talk real quick about one of the third rounders you mentioned at pick 81. You added 2 other third rounders trading down with the Packers, but Jordan Morgan from Arizona, he played left tackle throughout his time with the Wildcats. And yet I look at the athletic profile. He had a really impressive combine performance. And this is just a little over a year after tearing his ACL, by the way. He made it back and started 12 games for the Wildcats, was a first-team All-Pac-12 selection. But I look at the athleticism, the fact he's 6'5", 311, and I see a guard in the NFL. I think he would be able to slide right inside. Oh, who needs a guard right now? The Seattle Seahawks. They could use one. So I look at this as a guy that without the injuries, he might be a second-round, maybe even late first-round pick, even in this draft class. This guy is a really talented player. He's shown the toughness coming back from injuries. I would love that there. The other 2 third-round picks that you have, Dadrion Taylor Demerson is one of my favorite rising safeties in this draft class because he is a true free safety. He is a ball hawk, has a lot of interceptions in his time at Texas Tech, more than 70 tackles each of the last 2 years. He's been a pretty reliable tackler for the most part, and he had an impressive combine, ran the fastest 40 of any of the safeties. Really like that pick in the third round as well. As for your last selection coming in at number 91, I don't think I need to talk about Jalen McMillan very much. Jalen McMillan was one of the stud receivers at Washington, 6'1", almost 200 pounds, more of a deep threat, though I'm wondering if that's necessarily going to translate to the next level. I can see him being a guy that's going to be able to really carve defenses up in the intermediate game with post routes. Not necessarily the guy that's going to be running a bunch of vertical routes downfield, but that was a big part of his game at Washington. And Seattle has always liked receivers that can create big plays, and Tyler Lockett isn't getting any younger. So I could see if a player like this is available this late in the draft, almost in day 3, that especially with Ryan Grubb being the OC, it would make a lot of sense. So honestly, I want to rip you for these picks, but I love all 4 of them.
Well, I certainly appreciate that. Real quick, Jordan Morgan, if you like the idea of Troy Fautanu, then basically to me, Jordan Morgan is the exact same thing. As you mentioned, Corbin, this is a left tackle that we're going to be moving inside to guard. One of the reasons I think that he can do that is he's got sub 33-inch arms and he plays the physicality that you're looking for. This is a 4-year starter who has struggled with injuries and is a classic tweener. That's why I think that he is going to fall a little bit later on draft day than people are anticipating. Dadrion Taylor Demerson, the free safety, as you mentioned, great speed, great ball skills, 33 passes broken up, 10 interceptions over the last couple of seasons. And he has all of the intangibles that the Seahawks have always prioritized. So I think that he is interesting. And Jalen McMillan, speaking of intangibles, this is a guy that struggled with injuries this past season. That's one of the reasons why his statistics dropped, but he's got 17 touchdowns over the past 3 seasons. And when I was talking to people at the University of Washington Pro Day just about a week ago, Corbin, they said that Jalen McMillan was actually the big dog in the receiver room. Considering that Rome Odunze may be a top 10 pick, Jalen Polk is often bandied about as being a tough guy. Jalen McMillan not only has the straight line speed to be that vertical threat that the Seahawks are looking for, he also has enough toughness to be able to play the slot role as well, as we anticipate that Jackson Smith and Jigba may be sliding outside eventually. So again, to me, this is one of the reasons why I kind of really like this draft from the Seahawks perspective, is because they're going to have so much perspective when it comes to the 2 best teams in all of college football a year ago, the University of Michigan and Washington Huskies.
When we come back, we've got a bunch more picks on day 3 that we're going to dive into on Rob's mock draft, and we'll see how I feel about these 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th rounders. We'll get to those up next here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Locked On Seahawks is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you do if you had an extra hour in your day? For me, I wish I had a bit more time for painting and creating artwork. The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make sure it's a priority. BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs and can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. Therapy has worked wonders for many people, including myself, and several members of my family. But don't just take our word for it. Having someone in your corner to guide you when you're struggling to navigate obstacles can be invaluable. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Get 10% off your first month at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s out there. As always, thanks for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Continuing Rob's 7-round mock draft here on Mock Draft Monday, it's time to dive into day 3. Now, Rob, none of the picks that you acquired from the Packers are on day 3. We covered those picks in our earlier first 3 rounds. But you now have 5 selections to work with on day 3. Let's go through your picks, good sir.
Yeah, I basically have it number 102 overall, Trevor Keegan, a left guard for Michigan. It's a 3-year starter, 37 games, all of them starting at the left guard position for a team that, again, not only won the national championship, but won the Joe Moore Award in 2021 and 2022. 6'5", 310 pounds, like the aforementioned Jordan Morgan, just has stubby arms, 32 and 3/8-inch arms, and that's one of the reasons why I think that Trevor Keegan, who I view as a future starter in the NFL, might be available here at the top of the 4th round. Speaking of future starters, Corbin, I got to just kind of gush about 2 linebackers who I really think, if the Seahawks are not going to be able to bring in a player like a Junior Colson for Michigan, who we've talked about an awful lot, then 2 players Seattle has already shown enough interest in that they are actually top 30 visits. Nathaniel Watson from Mississippi State, 6'2", 233-pounder, who is as physical at the point of attack and has the pass rush ability that Mike McDonald has already said that he very much is prioritizing here. I mean, Watson has 21 sacks over the last couple of seasons. You rarely see that from inside linebackers, as well as Tyrese Knight, another player the Seahawks have had in as a top 30 visit from UTEP. So we talked so much about should the Seahawks be trying to bring in a former teammate of Devin Witherspoon's from Illinois, which I'm about to talk about here in a moment. Well, why not bring in a former teammate of Reek Woolen from UTEP as well? Tyrese Knight, 6'1", 233 pounds. He's got a little bit of a Tasmanian devil style to him. It actually kind of reminds me of the free agent that they brought in from the Buffalo Bills, Tyrell Dodson, in that he just hits everything. He doesn't necessarily always know where the ball is, and that's one of the reasons why I think that he might be a day 3 selection. But at number 192 overall, I really think that he could be a special teams demon and a guy that has the upside to suggest that he could be a starter inside linebacker in a traditional 3-4 defense. And I don't want to slip on one of my favorite players in this entire draft class when it comes to the Seahawks, and that being Tip Ryman, the tight end from Illinois. As I mentioned before, there's going to be a Devin Witherspoon former teammate here, and Tip Ryman, 6'5", 271 pounds. He's a completely different type of a player than what the Seahawks are presumably going to be starting at tight end with Noah Fant returning here. This is a powerful guy that also impressed with his athleticism at the combine. He only had 19 receptions this past season for the Fine Line, and that was a career high. His 3 touchdowns, again, a career high. But the caliber of catches that he had were really impressive. It actually kind of, his tape reminds me a little bit of a young Will Dissly, who of course the Seahawks are going to be replacing here at this point. And then finally, with the 7th and final selection, 7th round selection, the 9th overall, due to the trade that I made here with the Green Bay Packers in this projection, John Reese Plumlee, a quarterback from Central Florida. And this to me just strikes so many of the boxes that John Schneider has always prioritized. Talking about a dynamic athlete. He was a starter for not only Ole Miss and Central Florida as the quarterback, but also on their respective baseball teams. He actually signed as a 4-star recruit with Georgia initially, or at least agreed to go with the Georgia Bulldogs initially, but they weren't going to let him play baseball. And this young man wants to play baseball. He's undersized, 6 foot, 200 pounds. He wasn't even invited to the combine, but he was very impressive at the East-West Shrine Bowl. And this is a guy that has the dual threat ability that I think the Seahawks are looking to have. I don't think that he is going to push Geno Smith or Sam Howell for legitimate playing time, but I think he can be a practice squad guy. And with the Seahawks currently only having 2 quarterbacks on their roster, I would not be surprised at all if John Schneider is going to hold that final 7th round pick firm and be able to take a quarterback that he might ultimately wind up instead having to wait until undrafted free agency. I think he wants to use that pick on a guy that he could use in some sub packages, similar to the way the Philadelphia Eagles, of course, have used their superstar Jalen Hurts.
Yeah, that's a really interesting last pick there, not just because, and look, I don't think you intentionally did this, but there are, I think, 4 guys here that are listed as top 30 visits for the Seattle Seahawks so far. And listen, look at last year's draft. 3 of the guys that they drafted visited in top 30 visits. So those certainly are important. And when I look at these last 5 picks, Keegan's a player that I think this is about the sweet spot to get him, because I do have some questions about his athleticism, particularly when it comes to the zone blocking game and being able to deal with athletic pass rushers like you're going to see in the NFC West. But if Washington is going to be looking for that physicality and run more gap-oriented schemes, Trevor Keegan is as good of a power blocker as you're going to find in this class, particularly if you're going to be running duo and plays like that. Just let him fire out of his stance, get downhill. This is a physical, mauling style football player, and he can get to the second level too. That type of athleticism there, it's really the lateral movement stuff. So I like this pick from the value standpoint. And if Seattle's going to be running more gap, this pick makes a lot of sense. You also have the Michigan connection with Mike McDonald as well. As for the linebackers, this might surprise some people. This is just my viewpoint. The stats don't bear this out all the way around, but I feel like when you look at these 2 players, that I think Tyrese Knight might have the higher ceiling of these 2 players, because he's played off ball and he's also played off the edge. As you said, there are times he doesn't know where the ball's at. This is still a guy that's trying to figure out the nuances of football, and yet you'll turn around and then there will be 3 or 4 plays you're like, who is this number 10 just blowing guys up? As for Nathaniel Watson, I see a guy that I'm wondering how much better is he going to get in the pros. And what I mean by that is I look at the stats, I watch the film, I do see a thumper. I see a guy that can get downhill. The pass rushing ability is undeniable, and that will be something that jumps out to Mike McDonald. That's why he's got a top 30. But 4th round feels really rich to me for one big reason. When you turn on Mississippi State's film, the coverage issues that this kid has had the last couple years, I don't see 4.62 speed like what we saw at the combine. And that's not necessarily blazing speed. That's average speed for an off-ball linebacker at 233 pounds. If he was 245, 250, then I would love that time. Being a lighter linebacker, I just have concerns about his fluidity in space when he's asked to defend zone schemes outside in the run game and when he's asked to cover. So for me, I've got him down as a 6th or 7th rounder, which is crazy. He was the AP SEC Defensive Player of the Year. He's a good football player. I just wonder, is that going to carry over against the best athletes in the world in the NFL? And I have some reservations about the coverage stuff. So that would be the pick of these 5 here from a value perspective that I wouldn't necessarily agree with. I don't mind the player late in the draft because of his production, but this is one where I'm wondering, is he going to be able to replicate that at the next level? Because there are some athletic limitations.
No, I 100% agree with you. I think that's why you're seeing a guy that was the AP Defensive Player of the Year for the best conference in all of football, at least in my opinion, to fall, well into day 3. But again, I just think that the physicality and the closing burst, especially as a pass rusher, I think that does translate. But as you said, there are certainly some coverage limitations, and that's one of the reasons why I like Seattle's transition to a little bit more of a 3-man front, having 4 linebackers, of course, those 2 inside linebackers, I think are going to be able to help each other out. How many times were Seahawks fans frustrated when they saw Bobby Wagner or Jordan Brooks basically trailing a running back or a tight end because they just simply couldn't match up with their speed and agility? So have 2 linebackers out there rather than 1. To me, it just makes some sense given how dynamic today's pass catchers are in the NFL.
And I'm really intrigued, like I said, with John Reese Plumlee at that 7th round pick, because he ran for 1,000 yards at Ole Miss his first season on campus. And I think he only had like 500 or 600 passing yards that year as the quarterback. Like, he was a dynamic runner. Like, that could be a guy that you sign as an undrafted free agent, or you're drafting the 7th round with a quarterback label. You get him into camp and you're like, hey, can you play receiver? I mean, he's played center field in Division I at 2 schools and been a starter on the baseball team. He's just one of those really unique athletes that he might be one of those rare guys that can change positions on offense and find his way on a team, or be a special teams guy, because he is an elite athlete. And he's just a playmaker. This is a guy that wants to be on the field, and he's done so many different things. John Schneider has always been intrigued by those kind of guys. So if you can get him in the 7th round, a guy they've got a top 30 visit with as well, then it would make a lot of sense from the standpoint this is a guy that maybe you could look at in another position if he isn't going to be playing quarterback. So overall, most of the picks I thought really hit the spot in terms of value. I would say the only one is Watson, and they don't have a 5th rounder though, so that could also be why you take a guy like that in the 4th round, because you don't have a pick all the way till the 6th. There's a really large gap. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back tomorrow, we are only 23 days away from the NFL draft. So it is time for us to truly dive in head first. And we are going to start the discussion with the guard position. What a surprise. We're going to be looking at day 1 options, day 2 options, and our day 3 sleepers. We'll be breaking down a number of prospects on tomorrow's show. You won't want to miss it. Enjoy the rest of your Monday. Thanks for listening. Go Hawks.